The US just ordered BRICS to stop trading without dollars. Their response, a $648 billion trade boom, mostly in Chinese yuan. Now Trump's rushing to call Xi not to negotiate, but to stop the bleeding. Because if this call fails, the dollar doesn't just dip, it crashes. US bonds dumped, borrowing costs exploding. And the craziest part, America still needs to borrow from China to buy Chinese minerals, to build weapons, to contain China. This isn't diplomacy, it's survival. China just pulled off something Washington didn't think was possible. $648 billion in BRICS trade in 9 months, with more than half of it conducted outside the US dollar. According to China's General Administration of Customs, this marks a 5.1% increase year over year. But the real shift is in how it's being settled. 54.3% of transactions in March were done in renminbi, while dollar usage dropped to 41.4%, down from over 70% in 2018. That's not an economic trend, it's a geopolitical alarm bell. Bloomberg confirmed that the Safe or State Administration of Foreign Exchange data shows a record-breaking $724.9 billion in cross-border renminbi usage in a single month. The White House, suddenly realizing the dollar is bleeding relevance, has now issued private warnings to BRICS leaders to reverse this course. But why would BRICS comply when Washington's own tariff war is what pushed them into this corner? Beijing isn't waiting for a financial coup. It's executing one trade agreement at a time. The People's Bank of China recently announced it will, quote, facilitate renminbi-based cross-border financial services in Shanghai, a move meant to institutionalize local currency trade. BRICS economies, which now account for about 30% of global GDP and nearly half of the world's population, are responding in kind. China's exports of intermediate goods like aircraft parts and semiconductors to BRICS partners surged over 10% year-on-year, and over 80% of poultry and frozen fish imports now originate within the bloc. According to Hong Yong from China's Ministry of Commerce, this trade shift isn't temporary, it's foundational. And yet, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has warned that Beijing's strategy undermines, quote, global market reliability. But what exactly is unreliable about reducing dollar risk when Washington is weaponizing it? Trump's reshoring doctrine, once pitched as a revival plan, now operates like a subsidy to Beijing. Since April, the US has imposed tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods, alongside new 10% baselines for countries with even balanced trade. The outcome, according to April data from China's SAFE, China's total international trade rose to $66.8 billion, a 6% annual increase even as global trade slowed. The redirection is visible. Nations priced out of US imports are pivoting to Chinese suppliers, and they're doing so in renminbi. As economist Gary of Natixis told Bloomberg, from a geopolitical perspective, firms now have incentives to avoid the dollar entirely. The irony, US tariffs were supposed to isolate China, yet they're accelerating its integration with emerging economies. The more Washington tries to cut China out, the more the rest of the world buys in. Let's pause, because the numbers now point to an uncomfortable possibility. According to JP Morgan, reduced dollar settlements are directly shrinking global demand for US Treasury bonds. McKinsey's 2009 study estimated that foreign purchases of Treasury shaved 50 basis points off US borrowing costs, saving $90 billion annually at the time. Apply that math to today's $37 trillion national debt, and the potential cost explodes into hundreds of billions lost yearly. As Bloomberg Intelligence reports, international demand for treasuries has declined for 4 consecutive quarters, while US debt servicing costs crossed $1 trillion annually for the first time in 2025. Meanwhile, China, once the largest holder of US debt, has been steadily unwinding its position. Yet, despite these stress signals, Washington's only response is to demand BRICS cooperate and keep using dollars. is this diplomacy or desperation? At the 16th BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, member states approved expanded funding through the New Development Bank, now responsible for over $35 billion in project loans across infrastructure, clean energy, and digital networks. Unlike IMF financing, these deals come without US-centric conditions. China is the anchor. Its exports of steel to BRICS rose 8.6%, textiles jumped 13.4%, 4%, and electronics like tablet display modules posted double-digit growth. The strategic intent is unmistakable. Link emerging economies through physical supply chains and financial interoperability without relying on Western systems. According to Liu Ying at Renmin University, BRICS trade isn't just economic, it's ideological resistance to trade protectionism. So when Washington warns BRICS to cancel non-doll trade, it's not interrupting a new experiment, it's trying to reverse a working model. But what happens when the model doesn't need you anymore? The US dollar's strength has long been the quiet engine behind everything from cheap imports to global military reach. But what happens when the engine starts to stall? According to the OECD, US GDP growth is projected to slow to 1.6% in 2025. A sharp fall from 2.5% last year, while countries like India, Brazil, and China are forecast to contract by only 0.1% or less under current trade friction. The key difference: the BRICS economies aren't relying on foreign-held debt. Meanwhile, America's borrowing costs just crossed $1 trillion per year, driven by a shrinking base of foreign bond buyers, many of whom no longer see the dollar as their default store of value. Trump's tariffs may have brought in more federal revenue, but Bloomberg reports they're extracting that cash directly from US consumers and importers. And behind the scenes, Washington's quiet panic has turned into diplomatic scrambling. Because if Friday's phone call with Xi doesn't secure a rare earth supply agreement, the entire Made in America reboot may grind to a halt. The stakes couldn't be higher. Trump's call with Xi this Friday is no mere check-in. It's a structural test of the dollar's future. While US officials like David Perdue are scrambling to frame the dialogue as ongoing communication, Beijing's silence signals leverage. Less than 3% of China's GDP depends on US exports, according to World Bank data. While the US depends on China for over 87% of global refined rare earths, vital for both civilian and defense manufacturing. As Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CBS, withholding key industrial components is not what a reliable partner does, but Bessent's warning may land flat. China has launched stimulus levers of its own. With interest rates at historic lows and robust internal demand fueled by increased renminbi liquidity, the call might secure a reprieve, but if it fails, the fallout could trigger an accelerated sell-off in treasuries. And that's a problem no soundbite can fix. Diplomacy usually starts with a handshake, not a punch. Yet, while Washington urges BRICS to keep using dollars, it's simultaneously imposing double-digit tariffs on BRICS members and close allies alike. The UK, despite a balanced trade ledger, still faces Trump's new 10% baseline tariff. And Japan, once a stable partner, now risks contraction due to its $118 billion export exposure to the US, as reported by Reuters. Meanwhile, BRICS is being told to be reliable by the very system penalizing them for bilateral trade. Scott Bessent recently framed the solution as China should increase domestic consumption and reduce production. A suggestion that effectively asks the world's largest industrial base to step aside so America can catch up. But as economist Liu Ying of Renmin University put it, production is not just China's strength, it's its insulation against foreign coercion. At what point does policy drift into performance? If Friday's call goes sideways, the dollar's decline won't be gradual. It could accelerate with structural consequences. According to JP Morgan's second quarter projections, a 5 to 10% drop in the trade-weighted dollar is now expected over the next 6 to 12 months if renminbi usage continues to surge. Foreign appetite for treasuries has already weakened, with US bond auction participation by overseas buyers falling to 53.2% in May, down from 66% a year earlier. Bloomberg data shows should China begin dumping US bonds to defend the yuan or retaliate against sanctions, yields could spike and force the Fed into a no-win corner, monetize the debt and risk inflation or hike rates and trigger recession. Either way, the credibility of the dollar as a reserve currency takes another hit. And as the White House continues issuing financial ultimatums to the very countries it depends on to stabilize its bond market, the last question left is this: how long can trust float a currency? This isn't just a trade disagreement, it's a systemic test of America's economic model. One phone call might delay the symptoms, but the diagnosis is already in the data. The dollar isn't collapsing overnight, but its foundation is eroding one renminbi settled contract at a time. So what happens if BRICS doesn't back down? And what if Trump doesn't blink on tariffs? Let me ask you, if forced to choose between economic independence and US dollar stability, what would you do in their shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you think this is where the drama ends, you haven't seen what China's planning next, hit subscribe. You're going to need it. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your